Hello, and welcome to MedTech Frontiers. I'm Mike Heil, and today I'm joined by my colleagues Suzanne Levy-Friedman and Will Henderson. We are all attorneys in the medical device and technology practice at the law firm of Hogan Lovells. This series spotlights the pivotal forces shaping the medical device industry in 2025. We also provide training episodes covering basic regulatory requirements with which medical device manufacturers must comply. Today's episode is the first that covers training on general regulatory requirements. In this episode, we'll cover the basics of advertising and promotion. Both Suzanne and Will have a wealth of experience with helping medical device manufacturers comply with FDA's evolving advertising and promotional requirements. Based on their many years of experience, today's episode will provide you with a great summary of FDA's ad promo requirements and current expectations. With that, Suzanne, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Mike, and so happy to be on one of these inaugural episodes of the webinar. Thanks for the introduction. I am a counsel in the Washington, D.C. office of Hogan Lovells, which is also where most of us, but not all of us, in the medical device group sit. I've been with the firm for about 11 years now, and my practice focuses a lot on advertising and promotion, as you mentioned. I also help with all sorts of regulatory strategy and pre-market reviews, as well as some other types of post-market compliance. And I love doing advertising and promotion. I find that it's a really intriguing way to kind of put on your business hat at the same time as your regulatory and legal hats. So with that, I'll turn it over to Will. Look forward to talking with you all.
Hi there. I am Will Henderson. I am one of the folks that is not in the DC office. I'm a counsel in our Denver office of Hogan Lovells. I've been with the firm for 7 years. I'm actually a second career attorney, and I was a brand manager in pharmaceuticals long before I was a lawyer. So advertising and promotion is something that is near and dear to my heart. And like Suzanne, I truly enjoy working in this area, among all the other areas of medical devices that I tend to work in on a very regular basis. With that, I will pass the ball back to Suzanne so she can launch into our presentation today.
Great. Thanks, Will. All right. So just to set the stage, most of you probably know this, but it's important to understand what actually is a medical device. And you might be surprised to know that a lot of times this is actually a key question that comes up, especially in the software space, where it's not even clear if the rules and regulations governing advertising and promotion definitively apply to certain types of software products. So a medical device, I'm not going to read the whole definition that's on the slide here, but essentially it is a product of any type, could be a test, could be a software component, could be a hardware product, and it is typically meeting one of the following two or both of the following two criteria. It is intended for use in diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of a human disease or condition, and/or it's intended to affect the structure or function of the body. And it's important to understand that what really differentiates a medical device from a drug is that the primary intended purpose of the medical device is achieved not through chemical action on or within the body. And so you can see that the kind of bullets above that point on the slide could technically apply to a pharmaceutical product as well in many cases. But the key differentiator where there is kind of crossover is that a medical device is achieving its primary intended use through physical action. And so you probably have heard me now say intended use about 17 times. Intended use is central in determining whether a product is a medical device, and it's also central in the whole regulatory framework governing advertising and promotion of medical devices. So we're going to spend a bit more time talking about that today. Before we do that, I just want to emphasize that while we're focusing primarily on FDA regulation in this webinar and more broadly in our group, we do also advise a bit on Federal Trade Commission requirements around advertising and promotion. And that's because those two oversight authority regimes do overlap. The FDA and the FTC have worked together quite a lot, for example, during the COVID pandemic to enforce against violators. And the types of things that they look for in terms of not misleading the public, advertising in an accurate manner are all very similar. And so while we focus today on the FDA requirements, it's important to remember that there is also this other police agency, essentially, called the Federal Trade Commission, and they also have requirements that need to be paid attention to. So now another definitional slide. What are labeling and advertising, right? What is it even that FDA regulates when it looks at what manufacturers of medical devices put out there into the world? So a label itself is the actual display on the immediate container of an article. So it could be, what you see printed on a medical device carton. It could also be like the homepage of a software as a medical device product. And then the labeling is a little less intuitive because the key thing there is that it's anything written, printed, or graphic that describes the article or helps explain the article to external entities once it's in interstate commerce. And so it doesn't actually need to accompany the article, the medical device, physically. It just needs to supplement or explain it in some way, essentially to facilitate its sale or its explanation. And there was actually a US Supreme Court case on this many, many years ago, I think maybe 50 years ago, that actually came to that conclusion that accompanying an article, which comes from the statute, does not mean that a physical connection is required. So for those legal nerds out there, you have that little tidbit if you didn't already know it. Then you have labeling. So labeling is basically governed by FDA, and advertising is more or less split between FDA and FTC. Advertising is not specifically defined in the FDC Act, but it can often include information that is in sort of broadcast media, publications, journals, magazines, television, telephone communication systems. So when you're like in your car and you hear on the radio, it's not quite as common with medical device manufacturers, but it's become more common these days to kind of hear an ad on the radio for a variety of different medical device products. That's typically constituting advertising as opposed to labeling. But it is important to remember that in today's world, practically speaking, FDA can essentially assert authority over advertising as if it were labeling. And so the distinctions, while not unimportant, don't often tend to affect practice in terms of figuring out how to comply with FDA rules. Moving on to sort of the golden rule is what I like to call it with my clients, which is that a medical device can only be labeled and promoted for the intended use for which it has been cleared or approved by FDA, or if it's an exempt device within the scope of the exemption. And so let's break that down a little bit. Promotion is essentially any activity that's intended to facilitate the sale of a device. And so again, it's not just what you might consider to be promotional activity overtly, like going and giving a speech. Promotion really encompasses any external dissemination of material about your product, any discussion you have with a customer or a potential customer, or any kind of a buyer or a partner, right? Anytime you put information out there as a representative of a medical device manufacturer, that can be considered promotion under the purview of FDA regulation. And then the other thing to keep in mind as a general rule is that when you're looking at your marketing and promotion material and what you are putting out there into the world as a manufacturer, FDA really looks at the totality of the circumstances in determining kind of where you stand on the enforcement spectrum and whether it's worth it for them to kind of act against you. And so, of course, there are rules, there is the law, there is what's black and white, but in this space in particular, there is also a lot of gray. And while you should always try to comply with the law, it's important to understand where the risks lie. And FDA does take a totality of the circumstances approach, which is consistent with its public health mission. So what that means essentially is that FDA will look at everything you put out there into the world. It will look at what it deems to be the manufacturer's intent. And so it will take a look at everything you put out into the world and ask whether on balance, the impression you're giving to people is inconsistent with what you have been cleared to state, right? And it's important to remember also that the intent of the manufacturer is as determined by FDA in that analysis. And so the intended use, there's an intended use that is what you want as the manufacturer to say your product does. And there's the intended use that is cleared or approved by FDA, right? And then there is the intended use that is conveyed by your materials. And FDA decides what that intended use is. And the intended use that you convey through your materials and your presentation and your discussion, that is what determines whether you are or are not complying with the law. So it can be a little bit nuanced, but essentially what this is all saying is that what you put out into the world gets looked at by FDA reviewers, just like it does by anyone else. They will look at everything you put out and they will decide on balance if it complies or does not comply. And ultimately, whether it complies or does not comply is based on their determination of whether what you put out there is consistent with what they've said you can say. And so what that means is that it's not based on what you say it means, it's based on what FDA interprets that it means. Why does this all matter? Basically, because you don't want to violate the law And violation of the law in this case means adulteration or misbranding. Essentially, when you put out there an intended use that is inconsistent with what you've been cleared or approved for, and that would require its own pre-market authorization. So I will just say before I turn it back over to Will, this was all a bunch of important background, and now we're going to kind of jump into the nitty-gritty. And so one of the key aspects of evaluating your actual promotional content are claims. So with that, I'll turn it over to Will to talk to us about claims and what they mean.
Thank you, Suzanne. So let's talk about claims. So what is a claim? And kind of what the name would imply, a claim is a claim. It's a statement that you are going to make about your device, largely to promote it, to sell it. These are the things you want to say, and they can fall into all sorts of different buckets. And there's a list of them that you see on the screen. Indication claims, pretty obvious. That's the intended use. That's what's it for. Performance claims, safety and effectiveness. How well does it do the thing that you want it to do? Comparative claims. How much better does it do it than the competition? So all of these are different types of claims, but at the end of the day, you've got to be truthful, not misleading, accurate, well substantiated when you are making these claims. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides. But one thing I want to make sure that I emphasize is that claims can be express and claims can be implied. An express claim, that's easy, right? That's an overt statement. If I say that my device is going to make you walk again, that is an express claim. What's an implied claim? An implied claim kind of gets back to sort of the totality of the circumstances that Suzanne was talking about a minute ago. So for instance, I might have my device logo front and center on my webpage, and next to it, proximate to it, I could have a picture of someone leaping out of a wheelchair and running away. Well, I didn't say that my device did that, but I certainly may well have implied it. And when FDA is reviewing the claims that you're making, there is no distinction between an express claim or an implied claim. If it's a violative claim, either one, express or implied, it's violative, and you could be subject to FDA. Probably enough on that. So I used the word substantiated a moment ago. So a claim has to be adequately substantiated. It has to be based on scientifically appropriate, statistically sound information. It can't be false or misleading. You've got to be able to demonstrate that there are merits behind this claim that you're making. And oftentimes that'll come out of clinical studies. It can come from a number of different places, but it has to be adequately substantiated. Even if you are saying, well, we've got the data on file, you better have that data available for FDA to review it if they come knocking. An important part about not being misleading and adequately substantiating your claims is making sure that you disclose all of the relevant facts related to that claim. So if I'm your audience and you put a claim in front of me, not only do I have to know that thing that you want me to know about the performance or the safety of your device, I need to understand all of the potential limitations associated with the study, potential risks that go along with the device, anything that might be or might not be indicative of the clinical performance that showed up in that claim. I need to understand all of those implications so that I can make an informed decision about the merits of that claim. If I haven't done that, then my claim is not adequately substantiated, and it could be viewed as misleading. The last thing to consider is that your claims always have to be consistent with your existing marketing authorization. Not your aspirational hopes, not the things that you want the device to be able to do down the road or you wish it could do now. They have to be consistent with what you can substantiate the device is cleared or approved for today. So let's talk about comparative claims. Again, like Suzanne's slides, there's a lot of words here. I'm not going to read them all, but I want to hit a couple key points. So when you're thinking about a comparative claim, this is a claim where you're saying, okay, we're better than this other device, or we're at least as good as this other device. Well, when can we say that? We can say that when we have an on-label, head-to-head study against that other device. It has to be on label. You have to be using it for a cleared or approved purpose for both of the devices, and it has to be head-to-head. You can't take data from one study from this device and compare it to data from that study from the other device and say, well, this one did okay here and this one did this one here. So if we marry them up together, it looks like we're better. That doesn't work. It has to be a head-to-head study, so you have all of the same variables, everything's being accounted for similarly, and then you can truly demonstrate that your device is potentially superior. When you do that, if you're making a clinical claim, it has to be a clinical study. You have to use clinical data to support a clinical claim. If you have a comparative bench study, you can make bench claims and you can make comparative bench claims, but you can't extrapolate from that to the clinical data. So again, super important to always remember that if you're making comparative claims, which by the way can be implied, just like they can be expressed, you've got to have that head-to-head data. So last one, I think in the claim category we're talking about here is FDA review status. So what does this mean? There are various pathways that you can get your device on the market. It can be FDA approved because you have a PMA, pre-market authorization or approval. If that's the case, you can say my device is approved. Why? Because FDA has evaluated the data you've put in front of them related to the safety and the performance of your device. It's been approved. What if I went through the 510K pathway and my device has been cleared? Can I say it's been approved? No. Why not? Because that's not the standard. FDA doesn't approve devices that go through the 510K pathway. FDA evaluates those devices to see if they're substantially equivalent to a predicate device. And the standard there is whether or not you have the same intended use, same or similar indications for use, and you have the same or similar technology such that any differences in that technology don't raise novel questions that weren't evaluated by FDA previously. If you've met that standard, you might get pre-market authorization clearance and be able to put your device on the marketplace, but it hasn't been approved. And so if you say my FDA cleared device has been approved, that is a violation of a review status claim. You're saying it's something that it's not. You're saying that FDA held it to a standard that it didn't. Similarly, if you have a cleared device, any intimation that FDA evaluated the safety or performance of the device could also be a violation as a misleading claim. One that comes up often is a company might think, particularly if it's, say, a class 1 device, maybe it's 510K exempt, so you didn't have to go through that process. So a company might say, well, my device is listed and my establishment's registered. If you do that, that is also potentially misleading because that's just a ministerial act. Any device can be listed. Any establishment can be registered. It doesn't mean anything meaningfully about an endorsement from FDA. So promoting that regulatory status will often raise red flags, and it should always be avoided. Okay, last one of this set of slides, I believe, for me, is talking about general versus specific uses. So what are we talking about here? Sometimes I might have a very, very general indication or intended use for my device. Maybe it's just a broad surgical intended use, and I might want to promote it for lesser or more specific intended uses that you would think are subsumed within that larger, more general intended use. Sometimes that's okay. Oftentimes it's not. That is one of those areas where you want to tread very, very cautiously. If you're going to make more specific claims, when you have a general indication, you need to do a specific analysis about that specific claim. Look at FDA's guidance on general versus specific intended uses and see what it says, because changes in the function or the way you describe the function of the device, the population of the device, even the part of the body on which you use the device could cause it to be a misleading claim if all you have is a general indication for use. So always, always, always do a separate analysis to make sure that that claim you're making of a specific use related to when you have a general indication is okay. But remember, there's a good chance you've had conversations with FDA about this device. You might have had pre-submissions, you might have had other interaction. If FDA has suggested throughout those conversations that it does not agree with you making that specific claim based on your general indication, then you definitely want to avoid doing that at all costs. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't submit another 510K and expand your indications for use down the road, but if FDA is objected to it, when you have that general indication, don't make the leap and start talking specifics. And now those are kind of the general rules for the road on claims and claim substantiation. With that, I want to hand it again back to Suzanne for some more practical examples of what the company should do.
So yeah, this slide goes into some of the key practical advice that Will and I give out all the time to clients. Obviously, there are other pointers that we could give companies that come to us, but these are ones that we see come up again and again, right? And so we've sort of assimilated them into some key pointers for designing product claims. And these are things that really anyone at your company who has any connection to marketing should really be aware of. And this typically includes, medical affairs, clinical affairs. Honestly, even certain people in management should understand the very basic aspects of these rules in order to make sure that you're all working together to kind of put material out there that is effectively conveying your message in a way that FDA is not going to provide reason for scrutiny. So first and foremost, aligning with what Will was talking about, substantiation, FDA really values scientific rigor. So what that means is what you say about your device, all of your claims, they need to be truthful and they need to be based in science, right? You can't make an aspirational claim and expect the reader to just understand that it's aspirational. So things that are talking about performance need to be based in numbers, and things that are generally statistically significant, or if they're not statistically significant, they need to be kind of explained in context as to how those numbers should be interpreted. You need to provide enough information so that the way the reader reads your claim is the way it is supposed to be understood. The second one here is to avoid the use of absolutes, right? Because absolutes are really hard to prove. It's really hard to substantiate that no one else does, unless it's really the case. If you went through the de novo pathway and sort of FDA has agreed that you really are altering the standard of care in some way, then maybe you can make that claim in a careful way. But in general, you don't want to say that you do something no one else does, or that especially that you always achieve a certain result, or that your results are truly unique, right? Because those are all things that are very difficult to prove. And also, hyperboles don't really come across well to educated consumers. A lot of times, if I see something in the public zone, whether it's a medical device or something else, and it says, best ever, I'm immediately prone to scrutinize that and to wonder what it means. And so just keep in mind that going too far on the positive can actually make you seem less worth considering. Related to that, it's important to avoid words that imply superiority, right? So a lot of companies will make a claim like, we make a better implant, or, performs better than most other products. And there are situations where that type of claim could be tantamount to just puffery or, some kind of mission statement. But in most cases, that is a claim that implies superiority and could lead to some questioning from FDA. So you do need to use a comparative or superiority indicator in your promotional materials. Related to what I was saying about scientific rigor, data has to be presented in a fair and balanced way, right? And so if you are presenting positive results from a study, but you know that a reputable scientific institution did another study on your device and came up with results that put your results in question, you have to disclose those when you talk about your positive results. You can't just discuss the positive results and ignore all the contradictory or questioning data. You also need to keep in mind that statistical significance and clinical meaningfulness matter. And so if you have a case study, for example, that is a 1 in a million result, that's not a representative sample, and that does not support a general claim. If you try to position it as supporting a very general claim that applies to all users of your product, there's a good chance that FDA or a reader would perceive that as misleading. And so you want to be careful there, right? Things that are not completely false can still be misleading in context. The other thing that is really important to keep in mind that comes up a lot and has actually come up increasingly as internet and social media have become bigger drivers of marketing for MedTech is that all of what you put on your materials or in your speeches on your website is attributed to you as the manufacturer once you put it up on your website, right? You're including it in your materials is considered endorsement by regulators of that content. And so even if the content originally came from a third party, if you essentially adopt it by putting it out there in a new way, then it becomes your content. And so for that reason, all that content needs to be consistent with your authorized claims, authorized intended use. And so if you have a testimonial from a patient who used your product and had a fantastic result, that's great. And you should share that, but only if those results are consistent with what you were cleared for, right? And so to bring up an example that Will talked about earlier, if you have a wound dressing, for example, and it's helping to accelerate healing or to support the body's natural healing process, that doesn't mean that it's taking a chronic diabetic wound and enabling that person to allow them to walk again when before they were never going to be able to walk again, right? So you do have to be careful with those hyperbolic claims. The other thing to keep in mind is that even if it's an expert talking and they're going off label, you still can't take that quote and put it on your materials and say that it's not attributed to you. It is. All right, so I mentioned internet and social media. Everyone knows that those are two avenues that are increasingly used to promote medical devices. There's a lot you can say here. The most important thing, I think, number one, is that everything that you put on your website or in social media that meets the definition of labeling is subject to the same fundamental rules of the road as any other traditional print media or conference speech or brochure. And as I mentioned before with testimonials, anything that you put on your website or even anything that you put a hyperlink to, that's considered endorsement of that content. And so you do need to be willing to take pride of authorship in whatever is on your website or on your Facebook page or on your LinkedIn page. There are certain ways in which you can discuss things a little bit beyond your intended use if you have them on a separately designated section of your website. And so we don't have time to discuss all of that today, but for example, you may be familiar with many companies have an investor relations section of their website where they can include things like anticipated FDA clearance date for a device that's kind of already in the pipeline, or interim results of a clinical study. Information on those pages still has to be truthful and accurate and should still disclose the relevant risks, but it may go beyond the currently cleared use of the device or currently approved use of the device. Also, in this global economy, companies often market products in the US and in other jurisdictions. So what do you do with the internet and social media where you just go on a computer and go to Google or whatever, and you can have access to anyone's website anywhere? Most companies have adopted an approach that FDA has sort of non-explicitly agreed to, which is to have a portal page that directs the user to a US or an OUS, Asia, Europe, whatever the relevant jurisdiction might be, when they have a product that has different uses that are allowed in different jurisdictions. And so, you might see a pop-up when you go to some big company's site that says, are you in the US, or are you in Europe, or are you in Africa, or are you in Asia? And you would click one of those, and that would take you to a slightly different version of the website that is fully tailored to whatever uses are permitted in those jurisdictions. One approach that some companies have tried to take but have gotten scrutiny for is to put everything on one website and then to say in small font at the bottom, not all of these uses are approved in all jurisdictions. Please make sure to check the labeling for your jurisdiction. That's not enough. FDA does not believe, and FTC does not believe, that consumers or even doctors are going to take it upon themselves to do that. They want the manufacturer to take the responsibility to differentiate those indications for the people in the appropriate jurisdictions. Okay, as I mentioned with the investor relations intro, there are ways to share some off-label information about your product. And so it has to be done carefully, but there are numerous policies. FDA does recognize that in certain contexts and with certain audiences, there are valid reasons for manufacturers to need to discuss beyond what is explicitly on their FDA authorized labeling. So what are those reasons? They might include getting new investors. They might include recruiting clinical investigators or study subjects for a clinical study to expand your indication. They might include establishing a relationship with a large potential partner like a hospital or a reimbursement entity that needs to understand sort of your economic information in order to fully determine whether it's worth it for them to cover your service or your product, right? So those are all some of the examples where you might have a real legitimate business need. And this is what happens with advertising and promotion regulation that Will and I do all the time, where you have to kind of figure out, you have the law on one side and you have business needs on the other, and you have sort of finance and payers and all this other stuff floating around, and you have to figure out how to make it all work somehow. And so FDA has explicitly acknowledged that there are some limited use cases where manufacturers can discuss beyond their indicated use, but they are limited and they are for specific audiences, and they have numerous restrictions that go along with each of those safe harbors. And so, yes, they exist. Yes, we can help you figure out how to meet them, but it's not a free-for-all. And then the other thing I'll say is, everyone has heard about physician off-label use. So yes, doctors, FDA does not get into the practice of medicine. It has historically completely shied away from that. And there is what's called a practice of medicine exemption, where a physician can take a product that you have lawfully put on the market and they can use it for whatever they want in the case of patient care, right? So this happens all the time, especially in pharma, but in medical device use as well. Plenty of drugs are used for uses that have been studied clinically, but are not part of the actual FDA label because the manufacturer has not gone through the process of getting it actually authorized by FDA. And that's within the doctor's prerogative in the interest of serving their individual patients. But the manufacturer is not permitted to take that doctor off-label use and turn it into a claim, right? So the doctors can use your products off-label. Manufacturers cannot promote those off-label uses. And so that's a really important distinction that comes up quite a bit. So with those safe harbors, which we don't have enough time to discuss today, but we can get into perhaps in a future episode, the key is that whatever you share that way has to be non-promotional. So in addition to all those circumscriptions that I mentioned before, limited audience, limited context, specific rules, the content, the whole point is that FDA has not authorized your device for that use. And so whatever you say about that off-label use has to be said factually, truthfully, non-promotionally. And if you meet those requirements, FDA allows you, in those limited circumstances, to make those additional statements. Briefly, just to touch on some other promotional issues that do come up quite frequently, trade show presentations, right? So what do you do when you're at a trade show or a scientific conference of some kind, and someone comes up to you and wants to know about an off-label use? What do? So the best practice is to segregate the scientific discussions from the promotional displays. So ideally, you would have a completely separate sort of R&D booth where you would have medical affairs personnel that are designated to answer those types of questions. Now, in many cases, that's not practically feasible, but what is feasible almost every time is to have at least a separately designated section of your booth where you have only medical affairs people, no salespeople, and they respond to medical questions, right? And then you have the salespeople, the marketing folks on the other side of the booth who are talking to potential customers about the authorized uses. Press releases are another big one, right? Any company who gets a new clearance or a new authorization wants to put out a press release to tell the world, like, hey, we got FDA to allow us to go to market. And that's great. But what you put in a press release is still a claim. And so, FDA might allow you a little more leniency in that context, but you still need to be truthful. You still need to be accurate. You still need to be on label, right? And so one thing that comes up a lot is if you want to talk about something you're hoping that your device will achieve in the long run, you might be able to do that, but you have to caveat it with aspirational terms. You can't make it seem like this hope of yours is already being achieved by the device, right? Because you don't have data to show that. And again, like I mentioned before, with quotes and testimonials, right? Press releases often have quotes from the CEO or from commercial partners or from hopeful customers. Those are all great and they can be really persuasive, but you need to take the responsibility on yourself as the manufacturer to review them and make sure that they don't make any off-label claims, that they don't imply that your device is safe or effective for a use that hasn't been reviewed. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will for our last few slides to really touch on some important do's and don'ts and kind of recap what we've covered today.
Thanks, Suzanne. I am going to take us down the home stretch here. So looking at investigational devices, and Suzanne's right, this is where we kind of start to get into the what can you do and what should you not do. So for starters, what is an investigational device or a pending device? It's one that you have not yet submitted to FDA for review, or perhaps it's a PMA or a de novo where you have submitted it, you haven't received approval, or you haven't been granted your de novo, and there's a clinical study involved that FDA is reviewing. So those are investigational devices. So what can't I do? Well, I should not imply or certainly state that my device is safe and effective for the use for which it's being studied. And I can't say that as the manufacturer and the sponsor of the study, nor should my investigators say that. I can't promote or test market that device. I cannot prime the pump for my device that will be going out into the marketplace. I need to just sit on my hands for a while and wait patiently. As difficult as that is to do, it's where we are in the process. Now, I can do a few things. I can potentially disseminate some limited information to recruit investigators. Perhaps I can disseminate some technical information in the context of a scientific exchange of information. These are things that fall under those safe harbors that Suzanne was talking about just a few moments ago. And the key term when she reviewed it, and the key term now, is that when you do those things, they have to be done in a non-promotional context. And I would strongly encourage any communication like that should be reviewed by legal and regulatory prior to it going out into the marketplace. That's absolute. Now, one little caveat to all of this is if you have a 510K pending device, there's a compliance policy guide. It's quite old, but it's still enforced from FDA that allows you to, if you have a device where you've submitted your 510K notification to FDA, to advertise or display that device consistent with the indications for use and the information that were included in that notification submission to FDA. So you cannot take orders for it. You cannot go out and start actively promoting the device such that you're effectively selling the device or commercializing it at that point. You can advertise it and you can display it. It is a limited use and it's narrow, but it does apply when you have a 510K that's pending. Once again, talk to legal, talk to regulatory, make sure they're okay with whatever you plan to do. So now let's get into the real do's and don'ts. So here are some of the do's. So what should I do? And some of these they say they're do, but they're really kind of don'ts. Like do limit my promotional activities. So what am I limiting? I'm limiting them to whatever is cleared, approved, or exempt, right? Whatever's in the four corners of the marketing authorization that I've received from FDA for my device. That's where the line should be drawn. I should limit it to, or I should limit it to all performance claims that are substantiated by adequate scientific evidence. Restrict it to, even if it's an approved device or a cleared device, I shouldn't be talking about indications for use that are not cleared or approved. I should only use promotional materials that have been reviewed by legal and regulatory for that specific use and for that specific audience. Because even though some promotional materials may be perfect for one forum and have been approved by legal for that 6 Ways to Sunday, in a totally different venue with a totally different audience, they may no longer be appropriate. So all of your materials should be reviewed on a case-by-case use basis. And I think, yep, there it is, second to the last bullet. When in doubt, ask legal, ask compliance. I promise they'll help. So implementing SOPs to govern this process is a great thing to do. It's really important to be able to have that guide to look to and say, okay, well, in this set of circumstances, how do we approach this? What should I do? So we strongly encourage you to have SOPs that cover not just the review of your promotional materials, but that everything that we've talked about in much more detail in this webinar, especially some of the stuff that Suzanne talked about related to promotion on the internet, promotion via social media, testimonials, all of that should be incorporated into company procedures. All right, so some of those were kind of do nots, even though it says do. So let's move over to the do nots on the next slide, which you'll notice, shockingly, are kind of the reverse of what was on the previous slide. So don't promote a product that hasn't been cleared or approved by FDA. Don't promote a product for an unapproved use or an exempt or a product that is 510K exempt for a use that goes beyond your exemption. In those instances, the exemption is no longer valid. If you're promoting an unapproved use of a cleared or approved product, you are still promoting off-label. Do not do either of those things. As we talked about a couple slides ago, don't promote the safety or efficacy of an investigational product. Suzanne mentioned the medical practice exemption. It definitely exists, but don't train HCPs, healthcare providers, to use your products however they want. Providers should only be trained to use your products within the cleared or approved indications. Remember, make sure all of your promotion is well balanced. It's not false. It's not misleading. And something can be misleading just by omission. So making sure that you have the full context so that the reader can truly understand the merits of the claim that you're making is essential to making sure that what you are providing into the market is not in fact misleading. And again, we talked about express and implied claims earlier. Just because you don't overtly say something doesn't mean that it might not be misleading depending upon the graphics you use, what other information is proximate to the device, a name, or other information that's on the page. Couple more points. Don't use the FDA logo. There's a whole policy about this. That's something that might make them a little bit cranky. It's not worth it. And another good point to have is even though clinicians can ask you information about your devices, don't go soliciting those questions. Don't start asking them to ask you about off-label uses. You can quickly drift into areas where you are inappropriately promoting your device by doing that. Oh, and the very, very last point. I mentioned that I used to be a brand manager, so this is another one that's dear and near to my heart. Don't use your homemade sales aids. Only use materials that were approved by your sales and marketing leadership in your organization. They know the rules and they know what will work in the market and they know what'll keep you out of trouble. So with that, I'd like to hand it back to Mike to lead us out.
Thank you both, Will and Suzanne. It was very, very informative. I trust that our viewers found it useful and full of background and with the practical tips at the end. Just note that we're going to have another episode covering advertising and promotion. The next one will be covering current trends and compliance-related issues facing the medical device companies in the advertising and promotion space. We're also going to continue to do training-related episodes on other areas and key regulations, so stay tuned. So thanks again to Suzanne and Will and to you for joining us for this session. The conversation is only beginning.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.